Step 1. Front section of the cockpit. Parts needed are the main spine found in box number 2 and the two front sides of the cockpit, which are the largest styrofoam wrap parts. Hardware needed are 8 each M8 by 18 millimeter socket cap bolts. Now attach the two halves to the main spine, but leave the screws very loose until the end after attaching the foot or pedal tray. Now please note, if you purchase the Rev Tabletops accessory, this is a good time to attach this mounting bracket to the aft bolt holes at the top of the main spine. To attach the mounting bracket, just orient it like this, press it on, and run your bolts through, leaving them very loose. Next up is attaching this upper assembly to the runners, which are found in box number 3. Hardware needed: 4 each M8 by 80 millimeter socket cap carriage bolts, 4 each M8 flat spring washers, and nuts. This is the next to the longest bolt in your bag of hardware. Orient your runners with a slanted end at the rear and hover your assembly over the first and last holes. Insert your bolts from the outside in and thread on a flat washer, spring washer, and nut, but leave them very loose. On the runners, you will always insert your bolts from the outside in as it looks better. Step 2. Rear section of the cockpit. Parts needed are the left and right seat rails, which are wrapped in styrofoam, and the cross supports are located in box number 4. Hardware needed: 12 each M8 by 45 millimeter socket cap bolts, plus your flat and spring washers and nuts. Grab your two seat rails and orient them like this. Then orient your cross supports with the holes facing forward and attach one in the first 2 holes of the seat rails and one in the top 2 holes of the rear legs. Run your bolts through, but leave the nuts very loose. Lastly, attach this rear assembly to the lower section of the front of the cockpit, located here. Run all of your bolts through and use only a spring washer and nut to tighten. Please leave these very loose as well. Step 3. Pedal tray and main mount. Parts needed are the R brackets and pedal tray, located in box number 5. Hardware needed: 4 each M8 by 80 millimeter and 2 each M8 by 100 millimeter, the longest ones, and 2 each M8 by 18 millimeter socket cap bolts, and 8 each M8 flat and spring washer and nuts. Where you attach your pedals depends on many factors, but mostly it depends on your height. I'm 6 foot 2 inches tall and use my cockpits for all my work and gaming. I run my R brackets in the 2nd and 4th holes. Once you decide where you want them, hand tighten the R brackets to the runners using 4 each M8 by 80 millimeter socket cap bolts, washers, and nuts. Then grab your pedal tray along with your 2 each M8 by 18 millimeter bolts, washers, and nuts. Correct orientation of the tray is with the angled ends at the rear like this. From the front of the cockpit, insert your pedal tray. I recommend using the top holes, so attach one bolt and hand tighten. You will notice a gap at the other side, so brace the runner with your foot while pulling the other side of the frame towards you. Then squeeze the R bracket and pedal tray together. Run your bolt through and hand tighten. For the rear of the pedal tray, tilt your frame onto its side. You will notice a 1-ish centimeter gap at the rear, but it should remain as it is part of the design. Run one M8 by 100 millimeter bolt through and hand tighten, while maintaining that 1-ish centimeter gap, which is about the thickness of your fingertip. Next, to the other side, and remember to leave that 1 centimeter gap. Last, go back and tighten down all the bolts throughout the pedal tray and rest of the main frame. Alternating from side to side will assist in keeping your frame square. Step 4. Keyboard tray, shifter mount, and cup holder. Parts needed are the keyboard tray and shifter throttle mount mounting post located in box number 6 and the cup holder which is in a box labeled cup holder. Hardware needed are 6 each M8 by 45 millimeter socket cap bolts, 6 each M8 flat and spring washers and nuts, and 2 each plastic knobs. Attach your keyboard tray mounting post on whichever side you prefer, and this also depends on what you use your cockpit for. I will show where I mount these items on my cockpits, which are in these middle bolt holes here. Just run your bolts through the holes while making sure the flange is parallel to the floor while you tighten these bolts down very, very tight. Although be careful because you can collapse the side of the square tubing. The shifter throttle mount depends also on your use of the cockpit. I sim race and live in the left-hand drive country, so it goes in the first 2 holes on the right side of my cockpit. Run your bolts through and tighten them very tight. Lastly, the cup holder bracket. And once again, relies heavily on how you use your cockpit. I recommend just behind your keyboard mouse tray mounting post. Orient the bracket like this and run your bolts through, tighten, and insert the plastic cup holder. Now, let's take some time to build your keyboard and mouse tray. Parts needed are the articulating keyboard mouse tray arm in box number 7. Hardware needed includes 1 screw and plastic washer, which are already attached in the end of the arm. Also, you will need the smaller M6 hex wrench. Remove the screw and washer from the first joint, then set the keyboard tray mounting plate so that the links line up and secure it by hand. One thing to note, never over tighten these screws as you can break the plastic washers. Next, get the keyboard mouse tray located in box number 8 along with the cover. We're going to get this assembled now, but we won't mount it until the end. Hardware needed is 6 each M8 by 18 millimeter socket cap bolts, the shortest M8s, and 4 each M8 nuts. Place the keyboard tray upside down and orient it like this. Line up the articulating arms mounting plate so that the arm is on the outside and run 4 each M8 by 18 millimeter bolts through the inner bolt holes, i.e. the ones without nuts welded on. Secure the bolts with nuts, but leave the 2 inner ones very loose and leave the 2 outer ones a bit loose. Next, thread 2 each M8 by 18 millimeter bolts into the inside welded on nuts until you have approximately 5 to 10 millimeter gap between the 2 sheet metal plates. Please note, these are for countering any sag. Lastly, slot your keyboard tray assembly into its mounting post and check alignment. If further adjustments need to be made, just tighten or loosen the 2 inner bolts until your tray is level. You may need to loosen your 4 other bolts nuts to make room for adjustments, but once you are level, please tighten the 4 each nuts until they make contact with the plates. The underside of your keyboard mouse tray should look something like this. Once you've gotten it level, remove the keyboard mouse tray until later. Step 5, mounting the seat. First off, please be careful doing the following as you can hurt yourself when manually adjusting the sliders. We strongly recommend using a rag or gloves or some other type of hand protection. Parts needed are the seat, which is located in its own box, the long flat one. Hardware needed are 4 each M8 by 45 millimeter flat hex head bolts and 4 each flat and spring washers and nuts. Please note, there are 2 bolt patterns drilled on the seat rails. One forward set for shorter folks, one other set for taller folks. If you are 5'9" inches or below, you may want to use the forward bolt pattern. But from what I've seen over the past few years, the rear bolt pattern works best for most people. Lay the seat on its side and manually slide the lower slider all the way to the rear by lifting the handle and moving the slider with your covered hands. Then place the seat on the rear section of the frame and align your desired bolt holes with the last holes on your sliders. Once you're aligned, run two M8 by 45 millimeter flathead bolts through the holes of the runners and through the seat frame holes. Apply the flat and spring washers along with the nuts and only hand tighten. Then sit down in the seat and slide it all the way back. Once it is in its most rearward position, locate your front bolt holes and slot in the front bolts and hand tighten. Next, put your wrenches to work and do one full turn on each of the 4 bolts. Please keep in mind that if you over tighten these bolts, it will impede the slider's motion. Step 6, installing your keyboard, mouse tray, shifter, throttle mount, and main mount. First, grab your keyboard and mouse tray and insert it into the desired mounting post. Next, put your shifter, throttle mount into the others. Use the plastic knobs to tighten them down. Lastly, it's time to assemble your main mount, which is used for mounting steering wheels, yokes, or even other displays. Parts needed are the main mount located in box number 9 and number 10. Hardware needed are 4 each M8 by 18 millimeter socket cap bolts and 4 each M8 flat and spring washers and nuts, along with 1 each plastic knob. Now, before we move on, I should point out that if you fly with a stick and if you want to run an additional display for your instruments, then you need to skip down a bit further in the instructions. Some streamers also may want to use the main mount for a smaller additional display as well. It all comes down to what you use your cockpits for. For all other users, just attach the main mount to the male side of the spine using the 4 each M8 by 18 millimeter bolts. Insert the rear 2 each bolts first, which hold the mount in position, and thread on the flat and spring washers and nuts. And then the 2 each front bolts into the slots along with its flat spring washers and nuts. If you sim race, consider if you want your steering wheel more perpendicular to the ground. If so, adjust the tilt and tighten all the bolts down at your desired position. Everything is tilted off the rear bolts. If you are using a yoke for general aviation, I'd advise a very slight tilt or a flat position. These bolts need to be tightened very tight once you set it up how you wish to have it to meet your needs. Last, set your desired height and thread in the plastic knob, which is located under the top of the spine. Now, if you're a flight simmer that uses a stick, then you can attach the main mount upside down to mount another display for instruments. Just attach by using the 2 rear pivot holes only, like this. Step 7, monitor stand. Parts needed are the monitor mount connector with articulating arms and VISA mount plate, and 2 vertical posts located in box number 11 and 12. Hardware needed 2 each M8 by 45 millimeter socket cap bolts and 2 each M8 spring washer and nuts. Attach the monitor mount connector by inserting the posts where your desired height setting holes line up with the holes on the connector. For most people, I recommend the middle holes, but if you're shorter or taller than most, then choose the appropriate height setting. One thing to note, if you're using large monitors, i.e. 32 inches or more, then you might need to use the higher holes for the clearance underneath. Also, if you use a large steering wheel, i.e. the T500RS, you should consider mounting your monitor a bit higher. Once your desired holes are chosen, run your bolts through, and this time only from inside out. Apply your washers and nuts, but leave these bolts very loose for now. Next, Attach your VISA mount to the end of the arm. First, you need to remove this bolt along with the washers. Angle this bracket to the side so you can slip your bolt through just like this. Proper orientation is with this other bolt pointing down. Then thread in the bolt into the back of the VISA mount's bracket. Once you get it finger tight, then tighten down fully with your wrench while keeping the mount square. Next, we're going to build the legs of the stand, so you need the monitor stand base runners located in box number 13 and the monitor stand legs, which are styrofoam wrapped. Hardware needed: 4H M8 by 45 millimeter socket cap bolts and 4H flat spring washers and nuts. Attach the legs to the runners, making sure to orient the base runners properly. In short, the angled end of the runners is the rear, just like your main base runners. Legs should be oriented so they match the lines of the side of the cockpit, like this, so they are angled towards the front of the cockpit. Press the legs brackets onto the runners just over the holes. Run your bolts through and tighten down with your wrenches. Lastly, it's time to assemble the whole stand and attach your monitor. Take your connector with the attached vertical post and slot the post into the top of the stand's legs. To position the stand, just grab the top of the legs from behind, just like this, and position it over the front of your cockpit. Pull the legs apart at the bottom to stabilize, just like this. Next, grab your M4 bolts to attach your monitor to the VISA mounting plate. Let's take a look at the VISA mount. It will tilt and it will go up and down within the bracket, but you can also rotate it for portrait. The way you adjust these is quite simple. The single bolt that attaches the mount controls the rotation from landscape to portrait. The horizontal bolt here controls tilt and raising the mount up and down. The bottom bolt assists you when adjusting the height setting. Okay then, go ahead and bolt on your monitor using the appropriate length screw. If you have recessed bolt patterns on your monitor, then use the longer screws. Just make sure you only thread in 5 millimeters into the back of your monitor, or you can cause damage to your monitor. Stacked washers can be used as spacers. Then tighten down the horizontal bolt very tight while keeping your monitor at your desired tilt. Step 8, finishing up. First, go back and check all frame bolts, confirming they are tight. Insert your keyboard, mouse tray, and apply the mouse pad material cover. As you do this, be sure to start at one end and gently stretch it as you move along. Give it a good press all over to ensure maximum adhesion. If you get a spot that doesn't stick well, then a few dabs of super glue can get you squared away. Apply the cover to the pedal tray if you desire. This should only be used if you sim and use pedals. Also, apply the cover for the main mount as it softens the feel when using a controller. This serves as my mobile holder, and the neoprene keeps it from sliding off. Next, you will find 2 each plastic end caps. Insert these into the back legs of the cockpit to keep it from scratching your floors. And lastly, the M6 by 15 millimeter bolts are for attaching controllers to the main mount and pedal tray. Use them where needed. Well, that's it, and we hope your Rev cockpit will serve you well for many years to come. Thank you all for your support, and keep your eye on our website as we have some really cool innovative stuff in the works.